This definitely cannot be a top-down process, right? That involves some sort of grounded research. I think long before any even recommendations for change are made, I think it's important to really understand, again, going into the complexity perspective, just to understand as many of the nuances of the context as you can before making decisions that may work in one versus another. This is one of the challenges that I see currently working at an international school. And so to try to impose, again, this sort of top-down, this is what we want to happen, and so here's we're going to do it. It meets resistance if you don't have a very clear understanding of, again, the nuances of context. And so getting the voices of as many stakeholders, as many dimensions of that phenomena as you can, from teachers and parents to school leaders and students, obviously, very importantly, before you can even begin to sort of make those recommendations, I think is critical.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this new episode of TomoClub Playbook Podcast. We are back with another amazing guest whom some of you will definitely recognize as I introduce him, and perhaps some of you would definitely want to connect with our guest today. I'm your host, Shreyas. I'm the head of strategic partnerships at TomoClub, and I am joined by Dr. Eric Pilcher. Please welcome Dr. Eric Pilcher to the show. Hi, Eric. Welcome to the show.
Shreyas, thank you so much for having me. Thrilled to be here.
It's a real pleasure that we have you on board. I recognize you from our brief stint at Synthesis, and my audience would definitely love to know what you have been doing and how you are, what's your post-life after Synthesis looks like. So can you please introduce yourself to our audience? Sure,
definitely. And I definitely enjoyed just making all those great connections at Synthesis, and I still keep an eye on the great work they're doing there. Since then, I was actually finishing my dissertation while I was working at Synthesis, so that was sort of my side hustle while I was finishing the dissertation. So I did successfully defend that, as you mentioned in the introduction, and earned the PhD. And then I returned. I came back to the States, and I now currently live and work in Detroit with the public school system. I've always sort of been tied to local public school students and those unique contexts and those unique challenges. And so right now I am working at an international high school, the largest one in Detroit. And we're sort of interested in how traditional education is and is not sort of dealing with international and migrant populations here in the United States, which is obviously a really fascinating time to be involved in that conversation. But yeah, and so that's sort of where I am now, enjoying life as a teacher with students every day, which I think just keeps everyone learning. And I think the best teachers and leaders know that. So that's what I've been up to. Thanks for asking.
Absolutely. And I have known you as a great teacher, of course, and I'm sure the audience who are tuning in to this podcast will definitely take one or two key things that they can implement and perhaps make a difference in the lives of students. So without further ado, I'll put you right on the spot and directly address one of the key questions that I've always wondered about, which is the theory-practice gap, especially in the era which is dominated by AI. And I have had the opportunity to go through a few research articles that you have published, wherein your research points to teachers experiencing a sort of reality shock when they learn that what the training doesn't hold up in the classroom or in reality. And we see that across different professional development programs as well. Now AI is becoming a very key conversation between school districts and edtech companies. So from your perspective, both as a facilitator at Synthesis in your previous assignment, and now as a teacher in the public school system, and also your role as a researcher where you have understood the curriculum design in depth. What does it actually take to close this gap?
So I'll apologize ahead of time and say that I'm going to probably say this about 100 times about this complexity, this complex systems perspective. And because I think the paradigmatic shift, it's so fundamentally different in how we view all things from professional development to teacher education to student learning. that sometimes if we rely on, and just real briefly, I think the sort of touch points of complex learning theory is that there's no real predictable input-output relationship. That the influence of context on any learning environment is such that input-output relationships become unpredictable when you factor in the social, right, cultural dimensions of the learner, of the teacher, of the context. So just sort of laying that out as a piece, I think too often, whether it's teacher preparation or continuing education, professional development experiences for teachers, I think unfortunately a lot of times they're sort of designed and delivered under this assumption, this positivist assumption that if we simply put this thing in their hands, it will effectuate change. And the limitations of believing that simply adding input to a human being is going to fundamentally alter the output is one of those assumptions that's often going to set people up to fail, whether we're talking about where my expertise was sort of in culturally responsive practice, like how can we deliver practice that's specifically catered to unique student contexts. The assumption often is if you just give teachers one class about how to do this, then that will make them culturally responsive teachers. I think in the same way when you're talking about having teachers become AI experts or adapters even, the assumption is, if we just give them a class on it, then that will ultimately fundamentally change the output, where I think that's the flawed assumption. Whereas if we can't, the same way that we would approach students when we approach professional development is how can teachers actually use a small piece of this to make their lives easier, and how can we go from 0 to 1? And I think sometimes, unfortunately, professional development is sort of centered on let's get them adapted. Because again, it's kind of grounded in the assumption that it just takes one really good facilitator and all my teachers will become AI experts. When we know that's not true. It's far more complex. It's going to take iterations. It has to start in this very practical, usable phase before you can begin sort of scaling it out. So, it's just about making sure that those professional development experiences are practical for teachers who are often very busy with a million other concerns, and that they're very authentic, like that they cater to problems that the teachers have, not that the problems that the district sort of assumes they have or the needs that the district assumes they have. So.
Absolutely. I really recognize one specific thing that you said. We teachers, we are also in some form of or the other students ourselves, because the learning journey is endless. And I totally agree that we need to offer teachers an environment that is conducive to their own learning, and then have the PD around that so that they do understand what it is to experiment and how do the results influence their own teaching, and in turn, how does it influence the students. So I'm really in agreement with that. And moving forward, I want to specifically highlight two things that you said. So one is around teacher identity, and second is the AI adoption itself. So you work on the dynamic systems model of role identity, and you describe how the teacher's beliefs, their self-perceptions, and their goals are all deeply entangled with no common endpoint in sight, at least in the short term. So when we introduce AI tools into a school where there is this particular entanglement so very visible on the front, and we are not just changing the workflow, but potentially threatening how a teacher see themselves. So in this situation and in this dynamic environment, how should a school leader or a professional development learning designer be thinking about this situation, which empowers teachers and in turn gives them the knowledge and guidance they so much deserve to have? So
it's such a great question. Such an interesting time to be an educator with AI, because currently it feels like if you just sort of say the word AI, some teachers immediately identify themselves as either being threatened by it or being eager to sort of jump in. And so I think there's this kind of belief in popular or mainstream maybe culture that you're either pro or anti-AI. Which to me is sort of being like pro or anti-gravity, in that it's here, and so we have to live with it and figure out how to adapt it. And so I think an important step, and speaking of synthesis, I think that's something that they always did really well when they developed their teachers and developed their facilitators and coaches, was really be very clear about the role that you're playing in that space. And so I think one of the big ones that still sticks with me today, that Aaron sort of posited is, be a friendly, a supportive skeptic. And so for teachers learning to kind of integrate AI, I think like for designers of professional development, school leaders or district leaders, I think like really thinking about how can we integrate AI into a teacher's identity in a really healthy way so that they see themselves not as like resistant or opposite, the inevitable precursor to the AI education, but that they see themselves as experimenters, like you said, explorers of this tool, continuous learners, right? As lifelong learners, if that's really who we have in our classrooms leading students, then it should be easy to sort of position AI as a way to continue our growth as learners and humans and teachers and students. So it's definitely important, I think, to be very clear about what role do we expect sort of practitioners to assume, including AI as one of the dimensions. I just got to give a quick shout out. The dynamic systems model of role identity is Kaplan and Garner, and they were super helpful for me during that whole piece, just in terms of getting that complexity, that sort of that foundational understanding about how identity is impacted by these experiences. So I just want to make sure I definitely utilized their work, but I had no actual direct impact on that measurement instrument.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that is one of the key considerations we both, because I've been on the both side of being an educator myself and now working for TomoClub as a alternate learning system provider, wherein we focus on AI PD, AI literacy, as well as the future-ready skills. What I have fundamentally noticed, which you so very beautifully highlighted, was that we need to give the educators the freedom to model themselves as continuous learners. Because if they are not the role models, then I'm not sure who else can fill that role, especially for a student. And it is also imperative to understand there is scope for experimentation. And just one word does not encompass everything. And we will also have to work collectively as an educator, administrator, as well as a service provider to bring such a freedom where the complex topics are broken down into simpler forms, not in a way where it is too dumbed down, but at least in a way where the majority of the student community as well as the educators can understand that without being technically proficient, because that will definitely set an example for when they move forward. Because I remember one instance where there was a student who was literally afraid of coding and computer science. But because of this one particular teacher that we had trained, who then transferred the same understanding to the student, I just received a message last week saying that they were making inroads into a prestigious institution studying large language models, the LLMs, and computer science and coding. So that just gives us such a wonderful feeling, when there is a teacher making such a difference, which segues very well to my next question, which is the activist teacher in a change-resistant system. I think this is something which you have very well carefully highlighted in your articles and something that you have spoken. So just to give the audience a perspective, one of the most striking findings that I personally related to in your Q methodology study was the case of, let's say this teacher is Mike, who is a very strong activist with value-driven, and he just failed his practicum, partly because the system wasn't built to support someone like him. So AI literacy is being positioned as transformational, as we all know, but are schools actually set up to let these transformational teachers thrive in this fast-changing dynamic environment?
Yeah, and I think this kind of goes back to the PD question as well. It's how are teachers going to be allowed to experiment with it, or is it going to be another top-down mandate where you have to use AI in X number of assignments or an X, Y capacity throughout the course of a school year? And are we going to turn it into a categorical checklist of boxes to ensure that it's successfully integrated into 21st century classrooms? Or is the approach going to be more generative, where, as district leaders or as school leaders, we're empowering our teachers to do some exploring? And I think one thing I'm neither pro or anti, obviously, but I think one concern that I see in the early integration and adoption of AI studies is there's sort of a lack of empirical work being done. I know it's still very early, and I know empirical research moves slowly, but I think it feels almost to the point now where let's just throw AI at the thing, and see what happens. I think there is some value in that, as long as we're, doing postmortems and sort of decompressing afterwards and making sure that we're being value added with what results. But if, for example, AI is just going to be another fad that districts and administration sort of put into teachers' hands without, again, authentic support, problem and inquiry-based activities for teachers to undertake with the tool, so that they can then model those, like your student who is struggling to believe, to see himself as a coder, right? You get a good teacher who sort of models that. How do I integrate this challenge in the world into how I see myself? That model then serves for students to see themselves as problem solvers. So if that's going to be a rich experience, then absolutely. If it's, here's how you use AI and now go use it, well, then I think maybe we're missing some of the we're missing some opportunities to really develop teachers as authentic users of AI in their pedagogy.
I really love how you made a connection between the first three questions and diversified that to both a teacher as well as a student, because I've been a true believer in making all the different stakeholders, that is the teachers, students, parents, as well as the administrators, have a sense of belonging to the system. Which brings me to my next question, which is on belonging and the cultural cost in professional development. And again, picking on your paper where you say the pre-service teachers of color specifically introduces the idea of cultural cost as an invisible tuition students pay, perhaps in the predominantly white institutions. So does the same dynamic show up in teacher PD spaces? And if we are designing AI curriculum for a diverse teaching populations spread across the world, irrespective of which region they come from, what does it mean to make that curriculum culturally safe?
Yeah, I actually spent a year doing some consulting with some curriculum consulting and some curriculum coaching, and there was sort of this cultural cost involved, because the assumption as a curriculum coach or an instructional coach is that you're going to support teachers as they work on their own practice. But in fact, the expectations of some of these larger institutions you find yourself with is that you help teachers coach a predetermined set curriculum. And so when you think about what that means to teachers, to invite them into a space and say, hey, we're gonna help you touch the future. We're gonna help you shape education, and then really actually take away that ability from them. I see that as sort of being an example of why maybe so many teachers leave, right? Why there's such a high loss of teachers in those first few years, because what entices them into the practice isn't supported in the actual work that they're expected to do, especially if the expectation is simply to execute a sort of pre-canned curriculum. I think maybe part of that is why so many teachers are resistant to AI, is because they see it as sort of an inevitable step towards their own, replacement, which I think I mentioned before. But for AI integration, I think in the same way, if you bring teachers in to an ed tech space with the promise that they're going to be able to use the tool to explore their own identity, their own pedagogy, and then the reality of the position is different from that, then I think you risk maybe creating those kinds of tensions that are very, very difficult to resolve the same way, that you would with any teacher educator.
And how would you perhaps adapt this dynamic to suit an environment where, for example, as a service provider, we are based currently outside of the US with one of our offices in the US, but most of the team is still based in India, specifically in our case. And there might be other instances where the community might be, say, a Latin American or somebody who is not primarily in the US education system. So how would you then design the same dynamic to include, something which is as simple as bringing awareness to the education system in the country of choice, but in a deeper sense, having somebody else external to your country coming in and giving you the guidance? So how would this dynamic be incorporated to enable a smooth, I wouldn't say transition, but a smooth flow of communication, say, for example?
Sure. That's definitely cannot be a top-down process, right? That involves some sort of grounded research. I think long before any even recommendations for change are made, I think it's important to really understand, again, going into the complexity perspective, just to understand as many of the nuances of the context as you can before making decisions that may work in one versus another. This is one of the challenges that I see currently working at an international school. We have a high population of white students, of African American students, Latin American students, Arab students, and culturally there are some very different expectations, for example, for how students might behave in a classroom. Whereas the American expectation, right, is that students collaborate with each other and communicate with each other and question the teacher even. Whereas in many of their native countries, that would not be that is not the role relationship that you have with the teacher. And so to try to impose, again, this sort of top down, this is what we want to happen, and so here's we're going to do it. It meets resistance if you don't have a very clear understanding of, again, the nuances of context. And so getting the voices of as many stakeholders, as many dimensions of that phenomena as you can, from teachers and parents to school leaders and students, obviously, very importantly, before you can even begin to sort of make those recommendations, I think is critical. And then you can start to move the needle, again, from 0 to 1 is another sort of thing that I go back to over and over again. But just taking those first steps sometimes can do so much in how people see themselves and the progress that they're making.
Absolutely. I think what you said makes total sense, because a thorough understanding of the market that you are in, and again, as you said, making yourself feel belong to that particular system, I think that ensures there is some degree of warmth that is being put in, and your efforts will definitely be seen. So these are some valid advices. And let me take you one step deeper and come from a perspective of our students. So I would want to understand the student-centered thinking versus the system-centered thinking, because most of the pre-service teachers, they hold a very strong student-centered belief. Yet when schools adopt these programs like AI literacy and AI PD, the decisions are often made at the top and then handed down without any sort of a consideration towards the teachers and the people who are on the ground. So how do you reconcile the value teachers carry into classrooms, their roles even beyond what they do in a classroom, with the institutional structures that govern how they teach?
Shreyas, I mean, you have just put your finger squarely on what I see as the largest problem currently in education. This was the bulk of sort of my dissertation with Mike and these activist teachers in these change-resistant systems. And so I don't know that there's a solution or even an easy approach to a solution. I think recognizing, observing the problem is definitely the first piece, and being mindful that's one of the main tensions that you face is, if you really want growth, if you really want progress, you have to give up some control. And that's often not easy in an industry where categorical evidence of growth is really, really desirous. And that's why I think with the dynamic systems model of role identity and other kind of non-metric or organic kind of measurements, starting to develop those, which is part of my interest, starting to develop those will help us kind of see more authentic ways to actually measure authentic, learning, whether it's AI adoption or, student-centered beliefs. But until we're as long as we're sort of checking boxes, right, to say, the student attained this objective, the student met this, actionable standard, until we fundamentally rethink the way that growth looks, I think that that's going to continue just to be a tension that exists in current education. Wish I had a better answer.
I recognize this as a continuous problem. And as you rightly pointed out, I think we would be making one step or taking one step in the positive direction just by recognizing this dynamic shift. Because that is what I feel is lacking in so many different systems just fail down the line, is a simple lack of recognition. Because even when I speak to educators, they don't demand recognition in the public or, accolades and whatnot, but all they ask for is their voice to be heard. And I feel most times, even this is true in my coaching experience as well, that if you just offer some time to just sit and listen to what they have to say, I think that will solve 30 to 40% of the current issues that we have in the education system. Because I am a strong believer in systems level response, because that is where meaningful change can be brought in. And I definitely agree that this particular shift, given the current circumstance and the involvement of too many different departments and too many different internal restriction regulations, it makes it difficult. But perhaps we are not, put in a bad phase just to try and give one consideration to our educators, which now brings me to another a question which was deep within me to understand what does a good school look like. You have been on the outside working for a private organization. You have been within the researcher community, and now you're also working in a school. So if you could describe what a school that has genuinely figured out how to develop their teachers for a complex AI integrated world to make it simpler, and not a in a sense where they just do a pitch deck and enable their teachers to do whatever they do best, but rather to actually see, hear, and feel whatever they are building, and what is it that a teacher feels when walking into a school that enables them to be the best teachers they can be.
Yeah, I think you hit on that, in the question sort of, or prior to it, where you said you're a big believer in sort of listening to people and giving them that space. And I think the risk of over leveraging AI is that we take out the social emotional components of learning, which we know are critical. If you're not in a position to integrate this new information or these new skills or habits of mind, then you're just going to not take them no matter what. So making sure that the soil sort of is fertile enough to receive that, I think is a critical first step. And I think that's what you see in schools that work, is a place where students are rewarded for failure, right? Where struggle is celebrated, where the adults are the sort of model of how to interact uncertainly with complexity. Right? How do we wade into sticky problems, and maybe giving some sort of formal frameworks that will help them along the way. But yeah, I think that's the key. Is in the best schools I've seen and the best schools I've been a part of, students are always leading, and teachers are always in wonder, but also they're skeptic. They have a healthy dose of skepticism to challenge the students. Could you sell that to a different audience? Or, what are some of the limitations maybe of this thing? Are you sure you're looking at this from all sides? Just sort of challenge and inspire students in those ways, but also like in a very warm and positive sense. So I think that's that's probably my long answer to your short question.
Absolutely. And I definitely agree there is a need for positive skepticism because that is something which definitely motivates leaders and inspires them to keep doing better. And what you just told, sums up the entire conversation we had, where giving our community of teachers, parents, students, and administrators a sense of belonging to the system will definitely start making that system level response to a positive change. And I definitely feel like giving a little consideration to the community and having your presence felt in the room by just listening, seeing them, appreciating them will definitely make the system better for everyone. With that note, I think we are approaching the end time of a conversation. So, to give our audience one more actionable step, I would just ask you what would be two things that you suggest to ensure there is, if the conversation feels long to our audience, at least they can work on these two things to ensure they start noticing positive change and perhaps with time achieve the end outcome that they desire.
Yeah, I would say the first thing is to definitely get as much data as you can. And I don't necessarily mean statistical or numerical data, but qualitative data, taking the time to learn what your people do well and what your people need. Because education is this edge of chaos, right? It's always changing. And so there is no complacency. And so I think making sure that you've got avenues and that teachers and students feel safe and rewarded for providing feedback that you can use to grow your system. I think that's an important piece because without observation, the system will sort of just kind of carry on unheeded. So I think that's an important piece. And I think secondly is just, for all school leaders as well to sort of model that odd skeptic, that actual identity. I know the assumption is sort of as a school leader, you have to sort of carry this air of authority and assuredness. And I think to some extent, you certainly want to be able to make tough decisions and justify them. But at the same time, I think we're all sort of in unknown waters here. And so to pretend that you know the answers when they haven't yet been revealed to anybody, I think is a little disingenuous. And you could risk maybe losing some human credibility on your team or in your system. So those would be two key pieces of advice.
Thank you for sharing such an amazing insight. And I personally have a lot to reflect on. I would definitely be tuning into this conversation a couple of times just to ensure I start implementing the changes I want to see. And it has been a pleasure talking to you. My closing thoughts would be for our listeners to please tune in. Eric has shared a lot of actionable tips, and it just takes one small step to make a positive change. On that note, I will be meeting you on the next episode of TomoClub Playbook with another amazing guest who is also going to give us a lot of different insights on how to make the systems level response our own. So we start implementing these small tips. I'm Shreyas, your host at TomoClub Playbook Podcast, signing off. See you soon. Take care.